It is my great pleasure to introduce our second speaker, distinguished Professor Chandra Muzaffar. Dr. Chandra Muzaffar is the president of the International Movement for a Just World, or JUST. This is an international NGO based in Malaysia which seeks to critique global injustice and develop alternative vision of a just and compassionate civilization guided by universal spiritual and moral values. Dr. Chandra has published extensively on civilizational dialogue, international politics, religion, human rights, and generally on Malaysian society. Dr. Muzaffar authored 32 books or edited in English or Malay. Many of his writings have been translated into various other languages. Among Chandra's latest publications are A World in Crisis, Is There a Cure? And Reflections on Malaysian Unity and Other Challenges. In 1977, Dr. Chandra Muzaffar founded a multi-ethnic social reform group called Aliran Kesadaran Negara, or just Aliran. He headed this organization for 14 years. Today, apart from his role in JUST, Dr. Chandra sits on a number of boards or international non-government organizations concerned with social justice and civilizational dialogue. Professor Chandra was a professor and the director of the Social Justice and Civilizational Dialogue at the Center for Civilizational Dialogue at the University of Malaya from 1997 till 1998. And he was also a professor of global studies at University Science Malaysia from 2007 until 2012. Professor Chandra travels abroad frequently. He gives lectures and he is a sought after speaker at international seminars and conferences and symposia. He is also a regular speaker at meetings in Malaysia. Professor Chandra is the recipient of a number of international awards related to his scholarship and his social activism. He is married to Mariam Muhammad Hashim and they have 2 daughters. Professor Chandra Muzaffar, welcome to Islamic Renaissance Front webinar. This is not the first time you have been speaking at the Islamic Renaissance Front webinars for a number of occasions, and we welcome you again. It is a great pleasure to have you with us today on this very important topic. So without further ado, and noting that the time is running quickly, we would like to give the floor to you and let you present your perspective on the current situation in South China Sea, and in particular the US-China tensions and how it all reflects on Southeast Asia and the ASEAN countries in particular. Please, Professor Chandra, the floor is yours.
Assalamu alaikum. Peace be with you. Salam Sujatra. I'd like to begin by thanking the Islamic Renaissance Front for this very kind invitation, particularly Dr. Farooq Musa. I'm happy to be in this meeting. And I hope that we will get to listen to the rest of Sharifa Munira's presentation, because it is an important presentation and it's a pity that we have had this technical problem. Friends, my presentation will revolve around 3 statements. Number 1, the tussle for power between the United States and China over the South China Sea is, to my mind, one of the most significant geopolitical realities of our time. Number two, this tussle is a reflection of a much deeper conflict between a declining global power and an emerging global power with all its ramifications. Number three, the outcome of this conflict will, to a greater or lesser degree, shape human civilization for a very long time to come. Number one, the tussle that we've been talking about between the US and China. If one reflects on this, it is obvious that for China, the South China Sea is critical. It is its neighborhood. And this is linked to the theory of the neighborhood in international relations. What does one mean by this theory? That a global power or any emerging power would want to ensure that it has got a certain degree of control over its immediate neighborhood. This was the basis on which the United States in the 19th century, 1823 to be more precise, developed the Monroe Doctrine, which allowed it to control Central and South America and the Caribbean. One can argue that this notion of the neighborhood is also linked to the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Its control over Central Asia and Eastern Europe. That was also something which helped to sustain its power, and in a sense it brought down its power eventually, because the revolt in Central Asia and Eastern Europe was one of the factors which led to the disintegration of the Soviet Union. So this thing about the neighborhood and how much control you exercise over your neighborhood is quite important. And I think the Chinese are very much aware of it. And so is the United States, because the United States knows that if rising power is able to control its immediate neighborhood, then it means that it's more secure than someone else who may not be able to exercise that sort of power control. Now, the South China Sea is also important, which explains the tussle, because something like maybe a half of the goods that the Chinese import from outside, the goods that come to China from other parts of the world, they go through the South China Sea. Almost 1/3 of its oil goes through the South China Sea. And so the Chinese are very much aware of how important the South China Sea is to its own economic development, to its own survival in some instances. And they want to make sure that no one would prevent oil, gas, goods from reaching China through the Straits of Malacca and the South China Sea. So this is why I think they understand the significance of that huge expanse of water. Now, there is yet another reason why it is important, because it's true that the South China Sea is rich in minerals, It is also rich in terms of marine resources. It is supposed to be one of the richest in terms of its marine resources in the planet. So for all these reasons, I think the Chinese would like to be able to play a role in the South China Sea. And then, of course, the United States of America as the global power, which has dominated the South China Sea for a very long while, and no one had ever talked about it. During all those decades that the US dominated the South China Sea, they would want to continue with the dominance. Of course, they are arguing for continued dominance in the name of freedom of navigation. It is just like they control others, but the argument they use every time, the camouflage, is democracy, human rights. Likewise, they're using freedom of navigation, but basically what they're interested in is control over the South China Sea. And they see the rise of China as a challenge to this. As I said at the outset, it is the reflection of a much deeper conflict. We have seen so many dimensions of this conflict in the last few years in particular. There is the trade dimension, the US trying to impose sanctions of sorts upon China, basically various restrictions in terms of trade. We have seen it in terms of technology, what the US has done to Huawei, what it has done to China's MG technology, and numerous other dimensions of technology. We've seen it in terms of its attempt to even exercise control over Chinese education institutions. You know, the Confucian institutes that the Chinese have set up in certain parts of the world, that has also become an issue. And you find that in the United States of America, some of these institutes have been asked to redesign their program or to relocate because the US is not happy with these institutes, which are totally educational. They have nothing to do with global politics or with the question of power and dominance. You find that this conflict is also expressing itself in other platforms, even something like TikTok. This is the platform that a lot of young people have been keen on, and the Chinese have a fairly big following as a result of this platform that they developed, which was actually something that a US company had owned at one point. They bought it up and redeveloped it. Now that's become an issue. And you find that human rights is another major issue. Hong Kong, the question of human rights. And they're using that, well, again, if you look at the national security law in Hong Kong, it's no different from the security law in many other parts of the world. And this is something that most countries would regard as their domestic jurisdiction, as their sovereignty, their right to exercise control over their security. But it has become an issue. And of course, there is the Uyghur issue, the suppression, so-called suppression of the Uyghur minority. Here again, you find there's a lot of exaggeration and distortion. And unfortunately, some Muslim groups have also taken the bait, thinking that this is an example of how the Chinese have been treating the Muslims, when actually we know that a lot of the allegations that have been made are baseless. China has had a very, very long relationship with Islam. In fact, the first mosque outside the Arab world, West Asia, was actually built in China. And that long relationship with Islam, between Chinese civilization and Islam, is something that has expressed itself at various points in Chinese history, various dynasties. Some of those dynasties had inordinate Muslim influence. But all these things are forgotten, and now they're trying to make a big thing out of the Uyghurs, forgetting that there have been problems with terrorism amongst a small group of Uyghurs who had gone to Syria. Earlier on, they'd also been part of a terrorist movement, and this is very well established, including Western sources earlier on had talked about. But the point one is making is there are all sorts of attempts to distort the situation, exaggerate, lie, fabricate. The main purpose is to demonize China, to give the impression that this is an evil force which is emerging, and we must all be very careful about this evil force. Now, this is why a Chinese scholar once put it this way: he said, when we were socialist and poor, we talked of us as the Yellow Peril. The Chinese is the Yellow Peril. Be careful of this Yellow Peril. And now that we are rich and we're doing quite well and we're capitalist, as we know, China is largely capitalist in terms of its economic organization, we are still a threat. It's not the Yellow Peril, perhaps, but it is still a peril. In other words, it doesn't matter whether you're poor or rich, whether you're socialist or capitalist, they see China as a threat. And that is because of power. This is what we all have to understand. It is because the US, its fundamental goal in international relations is dominance and control, hegemony. It wants to dictate to the world. And the moment it sniffs what it regards as a threat, what it sees as a challenge, the slightest hint, it will react harshly and in some instances in a very brutal manner to ensure that that threat is taken care of. So this is what is happening, and unfortunately this could lead to a much worse situation. We don't want that to happen. There could be a military confrontation over the South China Sea. It's not inconceivable that this could happen. We're very concerned about such an eventuality because we will be affected. More than many other countries, the countries in Southeast Asia will be affected. And we have to play our role. We have to do what we can as countries in Southeast Asia, as Southeast Asians, to perhaps persuade both these global powers from doing something which is out of the ordinary, something which would not only shock all of us, something which could lead to a major conflagration. Our duty would be to play our role. And I would suggest that Southeast Asian countries should play their role. They should be more actively involved in this. They should read the signs, see what's happening. And as a conglomerate of states, as a gathering of states, I think they should come together and exert their influence. 600 million people, very important to both China and the US for strategic reasons and diplomatic, political, economic reasons. There's no reason why we cannot exert our influence. What are the things we can do? Very practical things that we can do. I think the people of Southeast Asia, ASEAN region, others who are in this region, we should ensure that the code of conduct that we've all been working on, China and Southeast Asia, not much progress. I think there is a need to expedite the code of conduct. There's some reluctance on the part of certain South Asian countries. There are also others outside the region who are interfering with the formulation and adoption of this code of conduct. The Chinese are not free from blame, neither are some of the South Asian countries, but I think it is very, very important that we should, as citizens in this region, put pressure on China, on the governments in this region, on governments outside the region to come up with this code of conduct that will govern relations between Southeast Asia and China primarily, but also relations between other powers and China and perhaps this region. Now, We should work towards that as far as China is concerned. In the case of the United States, and this is something that has seldom been talked about publicly, I think it is so important for the citizens of the world, including citizens from ASEAN, to convey this message to the American people, and through the American people to the elites in the United States, and not just the political elites, the other elites who are sometimes far more important than the political elites in the context of the United States of America. And what is this message? The message we would like to convey is, in all humility, the US has to realize that the world has changed. And this is an inevitable, irreversible process that's taking place. What do I mean by this, that the world has changed? The US is no longer the sole dominant power. Others have emerged. The world is moving towards a multilateral system from a unipolar system. It's becoming multilateral. Various other nations are exerting their power. They're exercising their roles. They'll be important in different ways. We should recognize this. And the US will always be an important nation, but it'll be one among a number of nations, not the only one. So this idea of being exceptional, you're the only one, that you have a right to dominate and dictate to the world. Very few Americans would ask, for instance, why the United States is so active in Southeast Asia. Can you imagine if some country from some other part of the world, some part of Asia, for instance, was extremely active in the Caribbean or in Central America or South America or in some other part of the world that is very close to the United States of America? They would be angry, they would be shocked that this is happening. But what the US does in different parts of the world, every part of the world, she sticks her nose in there, she feels that she has a right to dictate things to other people, to shape the world in her own image. She should realize that this is wrong. This dominance, this hegemony should come to an end. It is coming to an end. And I think it's going to be very difficult for the United States of America to play this role, even in very, very practical, realistic terms. It's a broken nation. The pandemic has brought this out clearly, that even in terms of something as fundamental as governance, the US is in such a mess in terms of governance. And look at the economic crisis that has emerged out of that health crisis. She's not able to manage. So the United States should realize that it should be humbler. It should be more modest. It should adjust to the world and look at what others are doing. Look at how things have changed. The landscape has changed. The whole atmosphere has changed. And the US can make a very big contribution to these things. It can, if it chooses to behave in a different way. Not as a hegemonic power, but as a humble nation which is willing to contribute to the rest of the world. You take, for instance, this health crisis. Earlier on, there were some American voices that had told the American people and the world that the US can contribute in, say, the Ebola crisis or other crises in the past by doing things that are quite substantive and quite productive. But today you find the way the US approaches crises of this sort, it is basically to demonize others, to demonize China, to isolate other countries, to try to rubbish the Russian vaccine and do things of that sort. Again, it's the same mindset. Dominance, control, we are the top dog, we must push aside everyone else. I think this is not helpful at all. And Southeast Asia, as a possible victim of a clash between the United States and China, I think it is so important for us to speak up, make ourselves heard, to ensure that we do not unwittingly invite disaster to our doorstep. We want to live in peace. After all, if you look at that great ocean, the world's biggest ocean, of which the South China Sea is a part, the Pacific Ocean. I'm sure we know this, that the Pacific Ocean means peace, because that's what the ocean itself is supposed to signify. So let us ensure that there is peace and happiness for the whole of the human family. Thank you very much.